Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely got it correct, and this is Tom Novolis, your host, and I am delighted to be here again with you this week. It has been one amazing week, especially for all of those in Italy. Some of you know that our son is stationed over in Italy, and getting an interesting report from him in that, obviously, the Italian people, the general population, are excited about their new prime minister. Obviously, the elites, the globalists, and all of those that are party to the European Union, which is all globalism, are very dismayed that people would have the fortitude to go against the elite. There is a number of very good analysis out there on that election. There's one in your notes at samueladamsreturns.net. There for today's program notes, you'll find one of the analysis there by Doug Wilson. Very simple, very clear cut, letting the new prime minister speak for herself. The second one is longer. That one is by Tucker Carlson. I found it to be very informative, as well as what we're seeing in that the media, global media, the global elites are coming unhinged. No different than they are unhinged with every patriot that breathes air and lets out carbon dioxide. Just as a side note, with a little humor associated to that for all those that are infatuated with Bill Gates and all of the environmental wackoism that he and many others are lying about and pouring billions of dollars into so that they can make billions more dollars, is none other than that of the CO2 gathering, where they are going to gather CO2. So for every patriot that breathes, if they can either eliminate every patriot, every Donald Trump, every new Italian prime minister, anyone globally that is a patriot, more power to them. That means less CO2 they have to gather. Oh, wait a minute. That means less money they can make on reselling all the CO2 back out. Oh, but what it really means then is that they're going to find a way to do little portable CO2 scrubbers so that as you breathe out, they will be able to capture your CO2, and they will be able to use that CO2 then in California and Washington State in particular to make sure that your body, when you die, takes and compost correctly. All right. Enough of that for my humor for today. And yeah, that was humor. Well, not really. But with that, I have to go on and say that we are talking about three items today. We'll cover very, very quickly the many faces of Christian nationalism. I spoke to you on an analysis of Doug Wilson's comments regarding Christian nationalism. One of my daily emails popped up from liberty.org that has a wonderful article and historically documented on the many faces of Christian nationalism, that it actually even goes into the perverted form that so many of the leftists out there that call themselves Christians are engaged in. And where did that come from? And how is it that we are in the situation we are? Because, as I always say, the pulpits allowed it to get that way. So that's one of the things that we will cover, one of the topics. It's not a thing, it's a topic. It's something real that we are all dealing with. In the second segment, I want to draw back into more on the Ohio Constitution and what happened during the 19 12 Constitutional Convention. I'm going to take another little bit of dip into that and just look at what is going on, talk a little bit more in that spread of that second segment, if I have time, about what's going on with the board or the organization that is there for Ohio in regard to the school board members, the Ohio School Board Association, and its perversions. Many do not understand that. And then in third segment, I think that I will ratchet back around and discuss. So let's see. Are you tired yet? I'm not. We're just getting queued up, right? In that third segment, I want to kind of bring in something that I also received from the Institute on the Constitution, Understanding Dual Sovereignty Doctrine. Where did that come from? And how I believe that the misunderstanding of that and the way that law is written and adjudicated is what is problematic, especially for that father from Philadelphia who was protesting abortion clinics and the debacle that he is in with the FBI busting into his home. And once again, we have the FBI busting into somebody's home when they said that they would come into the FBI office. Very, very interesting. So let's get on in the last 8 minutes here, and I apologize. I may carry into the second segment with this, but I do think that it's important to talk about the many faces of Christian nationalism. This is an article that is done by a John D. Wilsey, and he shared this in the lawliberty.org. It is there in your references. And it was amazing to me that, I'm seeing more and more that's coming out on Christian nationalism when, in fact, it is something that is almost a new phenomena being spoken of in these modern times. One of the key areas in these modern times that we have to look at is what is the pressing issue. And according to this article, and where he starts with the pressing issue, is relative to what happened January 6th, the election, and that, as we've heard in a number of instances, that this was considered Christian nationalism that was hitting that mainstream culture. I mean, that's the way that this opens up. Now, but most people don't understand what that means. And if you're a Christian nationalist, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a homophobe, you're right-wing, and there are many out there, especially those leftist Christians, say it's a heresy departing from the Christian faith. When in fact, as we brought up to you before in earlier programming, is that Christian nationalism started at the very beginning of this nation when the Puritans came over and New England was predominantly founded. What I want to go through quickly are some of the key points in this article. I highly recommend that you go and research it, look at it for yourself, and see what is there, because it's truth, it's fact, it is a moral basis that has become totally perverted by bad theology, and in particular by humanism et al. Isms that are out there. And quite frankly, we're going to start back prior to 1776. We're going to look at what happened with the Puritans. There's a guy who I haven't read the book, but apparently it's a pretty good one. George McKenna did a book in 2007 called The Puritan Origins of American Patriotism. I just want to comment that I'm sorry, folks, but I don't read a lot of modern books. You know that. I mean, there's a lot of good authors out there. I hear the likes of, a number of people that I highly trust saying and reviewing books by these others. But what I find is that there is so much in the original writings that formed this country to take and spend my time reading a modern author's writing about all of that. I prefer to go read the original content by myself. But there's a quote here where McKenna says that American patriotism, quote, dates back to the 17th century, Puritanism, yet it has adapted itself to all the modifications in Puritan-derived Protestantism over the past 3 centuries. Now, it's interesting to note that taking from another opportunity to investigate something, the author of a particular video and teaching, and that brought about on education, and talking about in the 1800s, especially when a lot of the Catholics started moving into the United States at the time, and starting, Catholic schools, parochial schools. The reason for doing that was not because the public school system was broke like it is today. In fact, the public school system, as this noted author commented, had not only prayer in the school, they had Bible study in the school, they were using the King James Bible in the school, they were teaching morality and values and all of that. But the reason for the parochial schools coming in from a Catholic side tradition was because all the public schools were Protestant. So they had conflict with that even in the 1800s, and that's why they started the Catholic schools. And both school types and systems became perverse as we moved into the 1900s, if you will, late 1800s, 1900s, because of all the bad theology, because of Horace Mann, because of John Dewey, and so on. So what does that have to do with this on the Christian nationalism? Well, that all affected it. That's where people got brainwashed as to the transitions from Christian nationalism, because American nationalism was always there. And as the article writer says, it's always been three-dimensional. We're going to cover as much as we can in the second segment, and I have to say we're going to blow out the Ohio Constitution in the second segment because we need to continue on with this. What we have here is that three-dimensional perspective is the people who have developed over the generations have cast a vision of America in space. That is, as in land. They've done it in time, and that's the orientation towards the past, present, future, and eternity. And in matter, as in its natural resources, its people, and their actions and relationships to other people. So since the colonial period, there's a lot that has gone on, and there was a lot that was brought to bear even from that theological perspective, that land was sacred. God gave us the land. God created it. We have this whole idea of stewardship. And what does that mean? That when we come to the ideas of that, it was important. Then the idea of a millennial kingdom from that Puritan Calvinistic perspective. And in fact, that Christian nationalism looked at it as something that would continue, that we were to work in establishing a Christian-led nation. You're not going to get 100% Christian people because we have a sinful world. We've talked about that before, but very, very interesting. Now, one of the areas that I do want to continue with is Alice de Tocqueville and what he wrote about that. And, I may even change it up because de Tocqueville and Abraham Kuyper had a very interesting comparison made of how they viewed economy in relationship especially to pauperism or the poor. Now, Sam Adams understood Christian nationalism because that's what he was. So come on back in the next segment when Samuel Adams does return. Thanks, and we'll talk with you real soon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it correct. We are talking about Christian nationalism as a continuation from the first segment, and there was something here that I thought was real critical. We hear people taking and quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, and I have to tell you, I am enjoying very much so rereading his great work on America. It's just amazing. Just in the first chapters, how he takes and actually describes what we were talking about in one of those areas, the land in America. His description is amazing. I just wish that people could get the mind imagination instead of all of the video nonsense. Books have great ability if you're a good writer. But carrying on from that, what de Tocqueville fundamentally was saying here, and what he wrote in 1835, is that patriotism is sometimes stimulated by religious enthusiasm, and that nothing is more embarrassing in the ordinary intercourse of life than this irritable patriotism of the Americans. Now, what was happening is that when de Tocqueville came to America and he made that comment and he wrote that, he said that the reason was because in 1830, Americans were so convinced of their moral purity that they would not abide any criticism of their culture, ideas, or institutions. How far have we gone from that? Isn't it amazing? We have no morals. We open for all sorts of criticism, except for the left about their cultural immorality. But when you are there and you're looking at your morality being strong, you're not going to let anybody criticize your culture, ideas, or institutions. That should be where the church is, or where Christian nationalism takes that express position. And that's what de Tocqueville was writing about. He was writing about the defined our national identity in normative terms. Our expression of devotion to the nation was limited to praise and adulation, not cutting it down, not disparaging, not what Obama did, not anything that the likes of Biden and all of his leftists are doing. No, that's not what it is. That's nationalism in general is something where you love your country, and that's what we're seeing in Italy, is that Italian PM is saying a God, country, and family. But he thinks she has it in the order of God, family, and country. And that's the way it should be. That's what built America. That's what builds a solid society. So anyway, we'll just move on here. And then the topical areas, which we're only going to highlight, is that he talks about the Puritan millennialism, and that was back in the 1600s. It came from that theological perspective that was introduced in the Old Testament. John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, he articulated it in this way in a sermon that was titled "A Model of American Christianity." Then in that, they were looking at what does it mean in covenant. And we don't even talk about rarely. There are some churches that do talk about covenant, but we are a covenant people. And in that, God blesses those who are in that covenantal relationship. And quite frankly, if you're not, if you're out of it, then guess what? He has a wrath that he will lay down on us, and he does that in a number of different ways. Then the author of the article talks about Samuel Danforth, who I've talked about. He was the first church in Roxbury, and he preached a sermon on Matthew 11, 7 through 9, where he saw Massachusetts fulfilling a biblical type of Israel. Cotton Mather, he wrote a large work called Magnalia Christi Americana, where he took and he saw New England churches as the golden candlesticks in Revelations 1:20. So what we have here is that when we look at millennialism, when we look at that eschatology that I talk about, the end times, how does that work when you look from the Puritan perspective? And that time frame was 1630 to 1750, just over 120 years. It was predominant in that a Puritan millennialism was the thinking and theology of the nationalism in especially the northern colonies. Then came the idea here, the title of Christian republicanism. And this was a time of about the American Revolution, the late 18th century. American colonies saw the English triumph over the French in the 7-Year War. Then they saw that there were the great forces of what they called the Antichrist in relationship to that. After this, we see that revolution drew a lot of inspiration in 1763 in England from the Bible, from English common law, the classical antiquities, some of the beginning of the Enlightenment, and a radical Whig ideology. And this culminated then in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, not 17, but in 1688 in England. And remember, America was observing all of that. We were around in 1688. So you have historians making comments on that, and they said out of this, what they observed was the idea of Christian republicanism was coming into the formation during that period of time. It was a blending of biblical language with English liberalism. And Jonathan Mayhew's sermon on the discourse on unlimited submission, which I've talked about on this program before, was one that built for this and what he said in opposition to tyrants. For a nation thus abused to arise unanimously and to resist their prince, even to dethroning him, is not a criminal, but a reasonable use of the means, and the only means which God hath provided in their power for mutual and self-defense. And that's where we have a right to elect somebody else to get rid of the tyrant that there is in office. So the political theory that derived from all of this is what this particular author is discussing as Christian republicanism that came from that, and how it was defined through these different preachers. Then came the idea of manifest destiny as part of Christian nationalism, and this was in the mid-1800s, 1845. A John O'Sullivan, he was a writer. He was at one time even a pastor in Europe. But he used the term manifest destiny in an article that he wrote, and that it was aimed at how Europe was attempting to limit our greatness and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So he was looking at it from the perspective that with the influx of people, that there was enough room in the United States to allow people to live across the whole continent and in particular within the context of America. So as he talks about that had a lot of other aspects. But what was going on also at that time is that we saw in the mid-1800s, this is when, as I always talk, is that we're seeing the changes, the theological changes, and in particular, because of how the Enlightenment influenced the late 1700s and worked its way into the 1800s, now we have a secular version of millennial political religion. In other words, a nationalism scholar by the name of Anthony D. Smith kind of coined that idea, and he was convinced, and he talked about a lot and taught, was that the will of God for America to overspread the North American continent, and because of this, America's rise to continental dominance was inevitable. And he looked at it from the vanguards of human progression. So it kind of made this shift from the Puritan millennialism to Christian republicanism, and now into this prejudicial form of nationalism and Anglo-Americanism that this O'Sullivan was really bringing into play and during that period of time. But once again, it was a theological shift that started to cause that, which then brings us to what this guy's talking about in the article, and he calls the Lincolnian Unionism. And this is about Abraham Lincoln trying to maintain the Union as the last best hope on the earth, and that was in 1862. In his second inaugural address that he made that. And the national vision that he had was that God was on the side of the Union, and that he was taking and he was looking at the way that justice could be brought to bear, but not. No, how do I want to say this? Lincoln experimented with these ideas of a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But when you start looking at what that meant in relationship truly to the Declaration of Independence, was he really getting that message across when in fact he acted almost like a dictator during the Civil War? Now, I have to tell you, we're down to the last 2 minutes in this, and we still haven't gotten out of this article. But I think it's important that we continue on this, and we may finish it up real quick here. So to Lincoln, the normative of the American nation as a paragon of a righteous government for all time, but without the radical chauvinism of Sullivan in the early 1800s there. So Lincoln's unionism was a Christian nationalism that was an exemplar to the world, manifesting hope and flourishing through human freedom and equality under God. So in the end, this guy feels that Lincoln was really trying to kind of roll back to the founding era instead of what O'Sullivan did early on during that initial periods there in the 1800s. I will follow up, and I think we have to carry over into the third segment on this particular article because there's so much in there. But in this last minute, I just want to take the time to mention that Christian nationalism has to have a moral basis. And we don't have that. And that's why anymore when we have all of these so-called candidate forums, I think they're a waste of time because the candidates are only blabbering things that will tickle the ears of the people and it has no context to it. They don't have any value because you're not really getting down to the nitty-gritty, as I mentioned last week as well, into who is the candidate, what they're all about, and how will they govern based on the people that they're surrounded by? It's critical to understand that they have a moral perspective to start with. It's critical to understand that those that will represent us in government at every level, including school boards, is a Christian nationalist similar to the likings of Samuel Adams. So come on back when in the next segment we're going to talk about the Wilsonian idealism. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it right. This is Tom Novolis, your host. And boy, am I glad you're still here in this third segment. At least I hope you are. But for those that are returning, please go to samueladamsreturns.net and either listen to the whole podcast there, watch the video, or at least go to the references and get this article that we are still talking about, because it is critical that you understand it. Christian nationalism, there's a lot of folks out there, especially on the Christian radio stations that this is being broadcast on, that are confused about who you are as a Christian, and then number two, what does Christian nationalism mean? So I highly recommend the programs already in the last programs that we did around that, but also at least go read how the confusion got to you today and why you're confused. This article is very good on that, because what we're going to talk about now in this third segment is the Wilsonian idealism. Woodrow Wilson, no matter what the article says, you can go back through a lot of my different programs, was a bad guy. He was a bad deal. He was a progressive. He was a socialist, almost communist. And he got in and helped destroy America and also make Christian nationalism and Christians stupid about Christian nationalism. I have no apologies for that, because majority are, because you don't read history. You don't get into understanding truth. Anyway, I was a little harsh with you there, but I don't know in these times, how many are really going to stand up and be willing to be counted according to what we're supposed to be doing as a people. Anyway, let's get to this on Wilson. Was the 28th president. He was involved, obviously, in 1917 with the war, with the First World War. One of his ideas and his interesting concepts on theology were that he believed God commissioned America to lead the world into Christian civilization through a defeat of Central Powers. When actually, he established it. He established the Central Powers. He was part of it. There's a whole idea historian here which connects Wilson's vision to Puritan millennialism. I'm telling you, this is a mixed match of Wilson and what the true Puritan thoughts were so divergent in what was on the sovereignty of God. Wilson missed that. This guy can say, this author, and the ones he quotes here from this historian, Milan Babic, Wilson missed the sovereignty of God. He looked to the sovereignty of men. He dreamt of an international order of Christian civilization. Doesn't work that way. Led by America, animated by America's intervention foreign policy. So the one that was really the corrupt dude, the powermonger dude behind Wilson, was John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under Eisenhower. What a mess. I'm telling you, Dulles, when you take and you really research him, he was a socialist. Once again, he was one that you can walk the fine line of communism. He was one that really, as much as they want to say, when you read his real writings and when you get into the truth of it, He was anti-family, anti-God. He was somebody that wanted globalism. He was one of the first globalists. But in this article, you'll read differently. Wilson, Foster and Wilson, they believed that it was their duty to help mankind everywhere to get the opportunity to be and do what God designed. I don't believe that what they did. That may be what this individual historian thought. But man, I'm telling you, I read their writings. I read what Dulles wrote in so many of his writings, and it's hard to really get that from him. So Wilsonian idealism, according to this article, is a Christian nationalistic manifestation because it was more successful at advancing Wilson's vision. And he made the efforts with the peace at Versailles, and it didn't last, obviously. So Dulles' efforts at forging peace after World War II in the Pacific, that was successful. And Dulles was all part then in taking and bringing about the United Nations. So Dulles became the most powerful diplomat in the world during the early years of the Cold War, and just because the U.S. and its allies confronted the Soviet threat. Dulles repeatedly reminded Americans that theirs was a Christian nation founded on Christian principles and the most powerful champion of civilization. And he labeled communism, as the purveyors of darkness and tyranny. It's really interesting how this author brings this all about. But once again, they were progressives. They were socialists. And they were not using the true Puritan idea of the sovereignty of God. They were using Christianity as a cover and as the idea of equality for mankind from a humanistic perspective. They were humanist. Christian America, here's what's finishing this up. 1977, a book came out, The Light and Glory by Peter Marshall and David Manuel. I've had that book. I've read it, a number of different times. And, he has a lot of different interesting perspectives. But what I have to say here is that it all comes down to what is Christianity in America from the very basic fundamentals of the sovereignty of God. That's what it really comes down to. You can read the rest of the article in the summations in here, and the bottom line is that we have to be Christian from the recognition, first off, that we're a fallen people. We need the only Savior there is, being Jesus Christ. And we have to understand very clearly that not only did he come alive from the dead, the firstborn from that, of his own right, and then the most important part is that he ascended into heaven, and there he is the sovereign over all things, including death itself. So if you don't have the sovereignty component of Christ nailed, you don't have that down, then you're not going to understand the value of Christian nationalism from its original context. It's not that you just need to be a religious people, because we're seeing that the religion of Environmentalism doesn't work. It causes division. It doesn't make people that which is, in God's eyes, equal. But it takes and it is a perversion of all things that are out there. So that takes me over to a very interesting article that I was reading, and I don't have up immediately on my screen, but I'll bring it up to you. But it is a unique comparison of what de Tocqueville wrote on economics, poverty in particular, and then the comparison. This author does a comparison in society and overall as to that of Abraham Kuyper, who you've heard me talk about many times, theologian, very strong Calvinist, and he was looking at from that idea of God's sovereignty, a strong proponent of God's sovereign over everything. In fact, Kuyper emphasizes in one of his writings here, sovereignty in the absolute sense occurs only when there is an authority that has no other authority over it, that always commands and never obeys, that does not admit of restrictions or allow competition, and that is single and undivided for all that has breath. God is sovereign, not man. So when we look at what we were with all these other ideas as it moved into what is that on Christian nationalism, without understanding the sovereignty of God, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. So the relationships here that when I look at some of the interesting areas that de Tocqueville was talking about, when he looked at the problem of the poor, he looked at the problem of what was happening in the 1800s, and these guys crossed over in their life by a period of like 30 years, and the way that Tocqueville was looking at the economic boom, the shift from an agrarian society to the capitalistic society, he said capitalism has a lot of its problems that it's bringing with it. And when he started looking at that, he was looking at that when human beings had lost their primitive virtues and society had become, quote, a place between a savage independence that they no longer desire and a political and civil liberty that they do not yet understand, making individuals defenseless against violence and deceit and tyranny. That's what de Tocqueville was saying as we move into a capitalist society. And how do we deal with that? How is it that we make those changes from feudalism and then into industrialization? And what happened is that when we moved into industrialization, people desired more. The bottom line is, before we had the explosion in capitalism, the biggest thing that people had to do was figure out what they were going to eat next, enjoy what they had. But then capitalism started to drive envy, and we have a lot of that going on in so many different ways. And so people's desires exceed the idea of mere survival. We're not going to be able to get into the full comparison with Kuyper. We'll have to pick up that at another time, or you can go and read the article that's there in the references at samueladamsreturns.net. So what happens here is that on the one hand, the concentration of industrial activities in land, especially in the movement of enclosures, led to workers losing public land as a guarantee of survival. To survive, they sacrificed their freedom, their time, and dignity by selling their labor. You have to remember, when you go to work, You're selling who you are. You're selling who you are. And that is your independent idea of how God created you. So you can become a slave to your employer. You can become a slave to anything that you are exchanging your money for yourself, your resources. Sam Adams understood that. He talked about that even back then. So come on back when Samuel Adams returns, and those anti-federalists got it right. See you next week.